My name is Eliana. I'm 25, and I've spent my entire life trying to be enough for someone who decided I never would be. The day I finally proved my father wrong wasn't just about a diploma. It was about the moment an entire auditorium stood up to rewrite my story. I can still feel the weight of that graduation cap, how it pressed against my forehead as I walked across that stage. The velvet of my gown caught the light in a way that made me look more confident than I felt. For a moment, I believed I had finally done it, achieved something even my father couldn't diminish. Then I heard his voice cut through the applause. "You'll never amount to anything." 5 words, spoken just loud enough for me to hear as I reached for my diploma. 5 words that should have been the final nail in the coffin of my self-worth. I froze. The dean's hand extended toward mine, his smile unwavering, unaware that my world had just collapsed in on itself. The microphone picked up nothing but the standard applause. But those sitting close enough saw my expression change. They heard what he said. What happened next wasn't in any commencement program. It wasn't rehearsed or planned. It was the moment that changed not just how I saw myself, but how I understood what family truly means. And it started with a single chair scraping against the floor. The breaking point. I need you to understand something about graduation days. They're meant to be perfect. The culmination of years of work, sacrifice, and determination. You practice your walk. You memorize when to move the tassel. You plan where your family will sit. What you don't plan for is public humiliation from the man who should be your biggest supporter. My father sat 3 rows back, his face a mask of indifference I'd known my entire life. He wore his navy suit, the one reserved for occasions he deemed worthy of his presence. I'd spotted him during the processional, my heart leaping with a childish hope that this time would be different. The dean called my name. Eliana Marie Winters, Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry, summa cum laude. 4 steps to the stage, 2 steps across, 1 handshake. That was the choreography I'd rehearsed in my mind. But as I took that final step toward the dean, I heard it. "You'll never amount to anything." Low and cutting, meant for my ears alone. My hand trembled as I reached for the diploma. The photographer would later capture the exact moment. My smile faltering, eyes widening with the shock of public betrayal. The image would become evidence of something I'd felt my entire life, but never had proof of. I accepted my diploma, turned toward the audience, searched for any face that wasn't his. That's when I saw Dr. Harriet Chen, my research advisor. Her expression shifted from pride to confusion to understanding in the span of seconds. She must have read something in my face, or perhaps she'd heard him too. She stood up, one woman, nearly 60, barely 5 feet tall, rising from her chair while everyone else remained seated. The protocol was clear: remain seated until all graduates have received their diplomas. But Dr. Chen, who followed every academic tradition with religious devotion, stood anyway. The graduate after me was already approaching the stage when Marcus, my lab partner for 3 years, stood up next. Then Jessica from my study group, then Professor Williams. I hadn't moved from my spot. I couldn't. The world had narrowed to this impossible moment, this rebellion against both protocol and paternal cruelty. My father's face darkened. He shifted in his seat, suddenly aware that something unprecedented was happening. That people were watching not him, but the impact of his words. One by one they rose. Not the entire auditorium, not yet, but enough that the dean paused the ceremony, the microphone capturing his whispered, "What's happening?" to the provost beside him. I felt the first tear break free. Not from sadness this time, from something I couldn't name yet. It was the sound of that first chair, Dr. Chen's chair, scraping against the floor that marked the true moment of my graduation. Not from university, but from a lifetime of believing I would never be enough. The shadow years. To understand why a standing ovation broke me open that day, you need to know what came before. The years when standing up for myself seemed as impossible as breathing underwater. I was 7 the first time I realized my father's love had conditions. My report card showed all A's except for 1 B+ in music. Mediocrity, he called it, sliding the paper back across the kitchen counter. My mother placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch saying what her voice couldn't. By 10, I'd developed a system: hide the failures, amplify the successes, and prepare explanations for anything that fell between. When other kids brought home art projects, I brought home perfect math tests. When they talked about weekend plans, I mentioned the extra credit work I'd completed. High school transformed the pressure from a dull ache to a crushing weight. I wasn't just competing against my classmates anymore. I was competing against the imaginary standard my father had constructed, a bar that rose with each achievement. Harvard accepted Diane Chen's daughter, he announced during dinner my sophomore year, though we barely knew the family. Early decision. The unspoken comparison hung in the air between us. I doubled my AP classes junior year, slept 4 hours a night, developed a ritual of pressing my fingernails into my palms during panic attacks so no one would notice. The physical pain was easier to manage than the fear of disappointment. College applications became my religion. I crafted personal statements that painted me as both exceptional and humble, listed achievements that looked impressive on paper but cost me friendships, health, and any sense of normal adolescence. The night the rejection letter came from my father's alma mater, I found him in his study, the envelope already open on his desk. "I expected better," he said without looking up from his computer. That night, alone in my room, something broke inside me. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way that makes for good stories. It was quieter, like a hairline fracture spreading through glass. I stared at the ceiling and made a promise to myself. I would go to the state university that had offered me a full scholarship, and I would never ask him for anything again. The morning I left for college, my mother hugged me tight in the driveway, slipping a small envelope into my hand. "For emergencies," she whispered. $300 and a note. "I believe in you." My father stood at the door, offering a stiff handshake and practical advice about campus safety. No mentions of pride or faith in my abilities. No acknowledgement that I was the first in our family to receive a full academic scholarship. I watched them grow smaller in my rearview mirror. Something that should have felt like freedom instead felt like exile. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that this separation would become my salvation. That 300 miles between us would give me room to discover who I might become without the constant shadow of his judgment. The night before orientation, I sat alone in my dorm room and made a second promise to myself. I wrote it on a post-it note and stuck it to my mirror. "I am not what he says I am." It was the first declaration of independence in a war I hadn't realized I'd been fighting my entire life. The unseen battle. College wasn't the escape I'd imagined. Instead, it became the battlefield where I fought for my identity without witnesses or allies. My dorm room felt temporary in ways that went beyond the standard issue furniture. I existed in a strange limbo, too afraid to fully leave my father's expectations behind, too determined to let them define me. I decorated my walls with molecular structure diagrams instead of band posters, chose my major based on future earning potential rather than passion. By the third week, I'd secured 2 part-time jobs, one at the campus coffee shop, where I memorized orders faster than names, another at the biochemistry lab, washing equipment for graduate students. Between classes, work, and studying, sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I called home every Sunday at exactly 6 p.m. My mother would answer, her voice brightening. My father would take the phone last, asking about grades and networking opportunities, never about friends or happiness. "The Morrison Scholarship recipients maintain a 3.9 average," he reminded me after my first midterms. I had a 3.87. The difference, 3/100ths of a point, kept me awake that night. The breakdown came during finals week of my sophomore year. 3 exams in 24 hours, 48 hours without sleep, a paper cut that wouldn't stop bleeding because I was too dehydrated. I collapsed in a bathroom stall in the science building, silent sobs shaking my body while other students washed their hands and reapplied lipstick, oblivious. I pressed my forehead against the cool metal partition and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt genuinely happy. That's when Dr. Chen found me. She wasn't supposed to be in the undergraduate building that day. Later, she would tell me she'd come looking for another student entirely. But there she was, her practical shoes visible beneath the stall door as she waited patiently for whoever was crying to either emerge or respond. "Sometimes," she said to the seemingly empty bathroom, "the strongest molecular bonds are the ones that form after something breaks." I opened the door. My face was swollen, eyes bloodshot. She didn't flinch. "You're Eliana Winters," she said. "Your organic chemistry professor showed me your synthesis proposal. Come to my office when you're ready." She left without requiring a response. The next day, still hollow-eyed but functioning, I found her office at the end of a quiet hallway. I expected a lecture about composure or professionalism. Instead, she offered me tea and asked a question no one had ever asked before. "What do you want from your education, Eliana?" Not what my father wanted. Not what would look impressive on a resume. What I wanted. I had no answer. "Come back when you do," she said, handing me a key to her lab. In the meantime, I could use a research assistant who asks the right questions. That key became my first possession that felt truly mine. Not earned to please someone else. Not achieved out of fear. Given freely with the expectation that I would use it to unlock something beyond a laboratory door. Over the next 2 years, Dr. Chen became more than a mentor. She became the first person who saw me, not my potential or my achievements, but me. In her lab, surrounded by centrifuges and microscopes, I built more than experiments. I built a family of choice. Marcus, who brought extra coffee without being asked when experiments ran late. Jessica, who left encouraging sticky notes on failed samples. Professor Williams, who argued brilliantly against my theories but never against my worth. They became witnesses to a transformation they didn't fully understand. They saw me begin to speak in meetings without rehearsing every word. Saw me risk being wrong in pursuit of discovery. Saw me stay late not out of fear but fascination. None of them knew about the phone calls home that still ended with me staring at the ceiling, counting my heartbeats until the tightness in my chest subsided. None of them heard me practice presenting my research to an imaginary father who finally nodded with approval. But they saw enough to recognize something was changing, and on graduation day, they would see everything. The turning point. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning during my junior year. Undergraduate Research Fellowship. Invitation to apply. Only 5 students would be selected. The fellowship offered funding, lab resources, and the opportunity to publish as primary author, a golden ticket in the academic world. It also required a faculty sponsor. I forwarded the email to Dr. Chen with a single question. "Would you consider sponsoring me?" Her response came within minutes. "Already submitted your name. Application due Friday. We start Thursday." The project I proposed was ambitious, perhaps excessively so. A novel approach to enzyme catalysis that challenged conventional methodology. The kind of research that could fail spectacularly or change how we understood biochemical reactions. I didn't tell my father about the application. Some fragile, growing part of me needed this to be untouched by his expectations. When the acceptance letter arrived, I sat on the floor of my apartment, reading it 7 times before allowing myself to believe it. I called my mother first. "I got it," I said when she answered. "The Morrison Fellowship." Her intake of breath carried years of withheld emotion. "He'll be so proud," she whispered. Those words, intended as comfort, felt like a hand around my throat. Why was his pride still the measuring stick? Why did good news immediately transform into currency for his approval? "I did this for me," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "I need you to understand that." The silence between us stretched until it nearly snapped. "I understand more than you know," she finally said. "Will you tell him yourself?" That night, I called my father directly for the first time in years. "Morrison Fellowship," he repeated after I told him. "Competitive?" 5 students from the entire university, I said, hating how quickly I offered this validation. Stipend?" I told him the amount. "Less than a summer internship at Merck would pay," he noted. "But the publication opportunity has value." I waited for congratulations that didn't come. "I didn't call for your assessment," I said, my voice barely audible. "I called because I'm proud of what I've accomplished." The silence that followed was different from any we'd shared before, not filled with my anxiety or his judgment, but something new. Recognition. "Your mother says you're working with Dr. Chen," he finally said. "She has a solid reputation in the field." It wasn't approval. It wasn't warmth. But it was acknowledgement. And for a moment, it felt like enough. The following months transformed me. The fellowship demanded everything: creativity, precision, persistence. I worked 16-hour days, fell asleep on the lab couch, woke to continue experiments. But unlike the driven exhaustion of my earlier years, this fatigue carried purpose. Dr. Chen pushed me intellectually, but watched carefully for the signs of burnout she'd noticed before. "Science requires rest," she would say, sending me home when my focus wavered. "Your mind works better when you allow it to breathe." The research began yielding results by spring. Preliminary findings suggested my approach wasn't just viable, it was groundbreaking. Dr. Chen arranged for me to present at a departmental symposium, then a regional conference. My father did not attend either presentation. The absence should have devastated me. Instead, standing at the podium before academics who challenged and engaged with my ideas, I felt something unexpected: relief. His absence created space for my presence. The final breakthrough came 3 weeks before graduation. An experimental trial yielded conclusive data supporting our hypothesis. Dr. Chen and I stayed in the lab until midnight, verifying results, running additional tests. "This is publication-worthy," she said, examining the data. "First author-worthy." That night, alone in my apartment, I called my father again. Not for approval this time, for closure. "My research is being published," I said when he answered. "The work I've been doing all year." "With your name first?" he asked. "Yes." "Good," he said. "That's what matters." "No," I replied, surprising myself again. "What matters is that I love this work, that I'd do it whether my name appeared first, last, or not at all." The silence returned, but I no longer needed to fill it. "Will you come to graduation?" I asked. "Your mother has already made arrangements," he said, which wasn't quite an answer. I hung up first, something I'd never done before. The action itself felt like graduation, a small ceremony marking the end of one identity and the beginning of another. The network I'd built, Dr. Chen, Marcus, Jessica, Professor Williams, celebrated with me the next day. We opened champagne in the lab against university policy, toasted not just to published research, but to the person I was becoming. None of us knew then how important this makeshift family would be just 3 weeks later, when my biological father would test the foundations of my rebuilt self-worth one final time. Graduation day unfolding. Morning light filtered through my apartment blinds, casting stripes across the graduation gown I'd hung on my closet door the night before. I'd steamed it twice, ironed the hood, practiced securing the cap so it wouldn't slip during the ceremony. My mother had arrived the previous evening, staying at a hotel nearby. She'd brought a gift, a delicate silver necklace with a small pendant shaped like a microscope. "To remember this day," she'd said, fastening it around my neck. She hadn't mentioned whether my father would attend. I hadn't asked. Graduation robes are designed for uniformity, not comfort. The synthetic fabric felt heavy against my skin as I dressed, the weight appropriate for the significance of the occasion. I applied makeup carefully, enough to look polished in photographs, not so much that tears would leave obvious tracks. The graduates gathered in the field house, arranged alphabetically. The air buzzed with anticipation and relief. Around me, classmates took selfies, adjusted each other's caps, made plans for celebration dinners. I stood slightly apart, scanning the room for familiar faces from the lab. Marcus found me first, his graduation gown unzipped, t-shirt visible underneath. "Ready to be done with this place?" he asked, bumping his shoulder against mine. "Ready to start what's next," I replied, surprising myself with how true the words felt. The processional began at exactly 10 a.m. We filed into the auditorium to pomp and circumstance, that strange, stately march that has accompanied academic milestones for generations. The audience rose as we entered, a sea of proud faces searching for their particular graduate among the identical robes. I didn't look for my parents. I focused instead on placing one foot in front of the other, maintaining the precise distance between myself and the graduate ahead of me. It wasn't until we were seated, the university president beginning his address, that I allowed myself to scan the crowd. Row by row I searched, my heart maintaining a careful neutrality. Then I saw them. 5 rows back, off-center. My mother in a blue dress I didn't recognize, smiling so widely it must have hurt her cheeks. Beside her, my father in his navy suit, expression unreadable at this distance. He had come. The president's speech faded to background noise as I processed this reality. My father had taken time away from his practice, had traveled across state lines, had put on his best suit, all to watch me walk across a stage for 30 seconds. A small, persistent part of me sparked with hope. Perhaps this was the beginning of something new between us. Perhaps the publication, the fellowship, the summa cum laude honors had finally proven my worth in terms he could understand. The Dean of Sciences took the podium next. He spoke about transformation, about how education changes not just what we know, but who we are. About how the graduates before him were not the same people who had arrived on campus years earlier. I thought about the post-it note still stuck to my mirror. I am not what he says I am. The conferring of degrees began. Doctoral candidates first, then masters. Finally, the sea of undergraduates. My row stood when instructed, filed toward the stage in the practiced order. Eliana Marie Winters, Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry, summa cum laude. 4 steps to the stage, 2 steps across. 1 handshake. I heard him as I reached for my diploma. You'll never amount to anything. Not whispered, not shouted. Spoken in the same measured tone he might use to deliver a prognosis. Loud enough to reach me, perhaps those in the immediate vicinity, but not to disrupt the ceremony. 5 words that should have destroyed the moment. 5 words that should have erased 4 years of growth. I didn't look at him. I looked instead at the dean, whose smile remained fixed, unaware of what had just transpired. I accepted the diploma, turned toward the audience as instructed. That's when I saw Dr. Chen's face change. Confusion, then understanding, then something fierce I'd never seen before. She stood up. The program stated clearly, remain seated until all graduates have received their diplomas. Yet Dr. Chen, who had once made a graduate student restart a presentation because he'd used the wrong citation format, deliberately broke protocol. Marcus must have seen her stand, or perhaps he'd heard my father's words himself. He stood next. Then Jessica, Professor Williams, lab technicians who had helped with my research. I remained frozen at the edge of the stage, unable to follow the choreography that would take me back to my seat. The next graduate approached, hesitated, unsure how to navigate around me. One by one, they continued to rise. Students I'd tutored, professors from other departments, staff from the coffee shop where I worked, the graduate advisor who had helped me apply for the Morrison Fellowship, a ripple effect of rebellion against both ceremony protocol and the cruelty of a father who couldn't recognize his daughter's value. My father shifted in his seat, his expression transforming from detachment to discomfort as those around him began to stand. My mother remained seated, her eyes wide with confusion, her hand gripping her program so tightly it crumpled. The dean cleared his throat into the microphone. "Perhaps we should pause for a moment," he said, looking to the university president for guidance. That's when the most unexpected person stood, the graduate behind me, a young woman I recognized from organic chemistry but had never spoken to. "Go back to your seat," she whispered, giving me a gentle push toward the stairs. "They're standing for you." I descended the steps, diploma clutched against my chest. The audience continued to rise. Not everyone, but enough that the movement could not be ignored. Enough that my father now sat in a pocket of seated attendees while standees surrounded him like a rising tide. I returned to my row, legs moving automatically. As I sat, I looked back toward my father. Our eyes met across the auditorium, and for the first time in my life, I saw something I never expected: uncertainty. He didn't know what to do with this public contradiction of his judgment. Didn't know how to process a roomful of people declaring, with nothing but their posture, that I had already amounted to something in their eyes. The ceremony resumed. Other graduates received their diplomas. Speeches continued. But something fundamental had shifted in that auditorium, and inside me, the ripple effect. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of speeches and formalities. The turning of tassels. The artificial moment when we were instructed to celebrate, throwing caps that most of us had wisely secured too firmly to remove quickly. It was the aftermath that etched itself permanently in my memory. As we filed out of the auditorium, I lost sight of my parents. The sea of black robes and emotional families created a chaotic current that carried me toward the main quad, where the science department had arranged a small reception. Dr. Chen found me first, moving through the crowd with surprising agility for someone her size. She didn't hug me, we had never been the hugging type, but she gripped my forearm with unexpected strength. "When someone tells you who they are, believe them," she said. "And when someone tells you who you are, question them." Before I could respond, she was replaced by Marcus, then Jessica, then a procession of people who had stood during the ceremony. Each had something to offer: words, touches, small gestures that formed a collective counter-argument to my father's declaration. "Your test review sessions got me through organic chemistry. I used your enzyme research as a reference in my senior thesis. You fixed the centrifuge when no one else could figure it out. You remembered my coffee order after I mentioned it once." Small moments, tiny impacts, the invisible ripples of a life lived with competence and kindness, despite the undertow of familial doubt. Professor Williams pressed a business card into my hand. "My colleague at Johns Hopkins," he said. "She's expecting your call about the research position." A position I hadn't applied for, hadn't even known was available. "We've been watching you," he explained, seeing my confusion. "Not just your research. How you handle failure, how you help others. Those things matter more than publications." I turned the card over in my hand, speechless. Another door opening because people had seen value in me that had nothing to do with my father's metrics of success. 20 minutes passed before I spotted my mother standing alone near a flowering dogwood, searching the crowd. I made my way to her, the weight of my diploma heavy in my hands. "Your father had to take a call," she said before I could ask. "A patient emergency." We both knew it wasn't true. Emergencies were handled by the on-call physician, a schedule my father guarded religiously. He had left because he couldn't face what had happened, the public refutation of his judgment. "Those people," my mother said, gesturing vaguely toward the auditorium. "They know you." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes. Better than we do," she added, her voice small. I wanted to disagree, to offer comfort, but the truth hung between us. Strangers had recognized something in me that my own father couldn't, or wouldn't, see. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" "For not standing." The simplicity of her regret broke something open inside me, not in the shattering way my father's words had intended, but in the way spring breaks through frozen ground, persistent, natural, necessary. "You're standing now," I said, taking her hand. We found a quiet bench away from the main celebration. She asked about my plans, the research position at Johns Hopkins I had just learned about, the paper being published, the apartment I would need to find in Baltimore. For the first time, she listened without translating my achievements into terms my father would value. She asked questions about what excited me rather than what would advance my career. Small differences that felt monumental. "He won't change," she said finally, her gaze fixed on the graduates and families celebrating across the lawn. "But I can." It wasn't a dramatic declaration of independence. She didn't promise to leave him or confront him, just a quiet acknowledgement that she could choose to see me differently than he did, that she could stand, metaphorically if not literally, when it mattered. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the crowd thinned. Families departed for celebration dinners. Graduates returned to apartments to change for parties. The maintenance crew began dismantling the stage where, hours earlier, my understanding of family had been simultaneously destroyed and reconstructed. My father did not return. My mother and I had dinner at a small Italian restaurant near campus. She asked about Dr. Chen, about the others who had stood. She wanted to know the story behind each relationship, how these people had come to value me enough to break protocol on my behalf. As I recounted these stories, I realized I was describing more than individual connections. I was describing the person I had become, when freed from the constant pressure to prove my worth. The person who could exist, had already existed, outside the narrow confines of my father's expectations. We parted at her hotel with a promise to speak soon about the logistics of my move to Baltimore. The hug she gave me felt different, less desperate, more genuine, as if she too had been partially freed by the events of the day. Walking back to my apartment in the soft evening light, still wearing my graduation gown because it felt important somehow to remain in this transitional garment a little longer, I understood that the standing ovation hadn't just been for me. It had been for anyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Anyone who had found their value reflected not in the eyes of those obligated to love them, but in the community they had built through authentic connection. The most powerful recognition we receive often comes from those who have no biological obligation to give it. 2 years have passed since that day in the auditorium. Baltimore suits me. Its gritty determination, its unexpected beauty in overlooked corners. My apartment is small but filled with evidence of a life expanding beyond old constraints. Books purchased for pleasure rather than advancement. Art chosen for how it makes me feel, rather than how it might impress visitors. Plants that have survived my initial neglect to flourish under more attentive care. The research position became a doctoral program. My name appears on 3 published papers now, with more in progress. I still work long hours, still drive myself toward excellence, but the motivation has transformed. I chase discovery now, not validation. My father and I exist in a careful detente. We speak on holidays and birthdays, our conversations professional and brief. He refers to my research in terms of prestige rather than substance, asks about career trajectory rather than fulfillment. Some dynamics may never change, but I have. My mother visits every few months. During her last stay, she helped me paint my living room a bold teal that would never have been permitted in the house where I grew up. "It brings out your eyes," she said, studying the effect. A small observation that acknowledged me as a person, not just an extension of parental expectation. I keep in touch with Dr. Chen through weekly video calls. She's become a collaborator now, our research interests overlapping in productive ways. "You've outgrown mentorship," she told me recently. "Now we're just colleagues who happen to have history." The card from my graduation sits framed on my desk. Not the formal diploma, though that hangs on my wall, but the small card the dean handed me as I crossed the stage. The one I was clutching when my father spoke those 5 words. The one I was holding when Dr. Chen stood up. It serves as a reminder of both moments, the attempt to diminish and the refusal to allow that diminishment to stand. Last month, I received an email from the university alumni office. They were featuring graduates whose work was creating meaningful impact. Would I be willing to give the keynote address at the upcoming commencement? The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 years after being told I would never amount to anything, I was being asked to address a new generation of graduates about achievement and purpose. I accepted. I haven't decided yet whether to invite my father. Part of me wants him to witness this public contradiction of his judgment. A wiser part understands that his presence or absence no longer defines the value of my accomplishments. What I have decided is this: I will tell the story of that day. Not to expose or embarrass him, but because somewhere in that audience will be someone who needs to hear that worth isn't determined by those who should love us most. That family can be found and built in unexpected places. That sometimes the most important validation comes from people with no obligation to provide it. The real transformation wasn't from student to graduate, or even from daughter to independent woman. It was from someone whose value was externally determined to someone who carries that determination within. From someone desperate for approval to someone offering recognition to others who might need it just as desperately. If you're watching this because someone told you that you would never amount to anything, I want you to know, they were wrong. Not because of what you'll achieve tomorrow, but because of who you already are today. The people who truly see us don't just stand up at graduation. They stand beside us through the failures, the breakthroughs, the ordinary Tuesdays when nothing remarkable happens except the quiet persistence of becoming ourselves. These are the people who matter. This is the standing ovation that counts. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is become this person for someone else. The one who stands up when everyone else is seated. The one who says, through nothing but presence and posture, I see you. You matter. You have already amounted to something magnificent.